Hello everyone, it's Father Hayes, and we are continuing our series on the Mass. So just to recap where we're at this point, we had just finished our last video talking about the introductory rites. So within the Mass, you've got two main parts and then two other parts at the beginning and the end, kind of bookending those main parts. So we had the beginning of Mass as the introductory rites, then we had the Liturgy of the Word, followed by the Liturgy of the Eucharist, and then the concluding rites. And so what we're going to begin to start talking about now is the Liturgy of the Word. But I want to put that in a little bit of context, starting with some historical context. We can say that the Liturgy of the Eucharist has been prefigured through the Old Testament with all the Jewish temple sacrifices. And before the temple was constructed, it was the tabernacle tent the Jewish people had in the desert with them. So Judaism is rooted in blood sacrifice. Particularly think of the Passover sacrifice, which of course prefigured our Lord as the perfect Passover sacrifice. So Liturgy of the Eucharist was prefigured in the Old Testament by the sacrifices in the temple, or before that in the tabernacle. And that was in a specific location. The Liturgy of the Word is a little bit different. It's not necessarily that it was prefigured, but we borrow from the Jewish synagogue services. Now, where did the Jewish synagogue services come from? Well, scholars say that the synagogue services may have begun first following the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem the first time. This would have been Solomon's temple that was destroyed by the Babylonians. And then what also followed was the exile of the Jews into Babylon. And so at that point in time, there had no more blood sacrifice. They couldn't offer sacrifice. In fact, one of the Psalms that was written during the exile laments that they have no temple, they have no sacrifice, they have no priests. So what did they do? Well, they focused on studying the scriptures that they had and reflecting on that. But then that was it's at very early stages, because many of the books of the Old Testament hadn't really been written yet, or at least not in their final form. So, for example, the first 5 books of the Old Testament really didn't come into the form that we know them until the end of the exile. So this was maybe a slow progression. And so what it is was small community gatherings, maybe in homes, particularly if they were not permitted in their current situation. And then after the exile, when they came back to Israel, they hadn't rebuilt the temple yet. So there was a focus on those small gatherings to review their scriptures and to really review where is God in our life, where is he directing us. So as I said, some scholars would say that this process began with the destruction of Solomon's temple in 586 BC. So then after the exile, they took to the practice of these small meetings in local areas. And that's one of the key things, is that whereas temple sacrifice had to be in a specific location, with the temple being in Jerusalem, synagogue gatherings could be anywhere, and were essentially everywhere, as we'll see. So when we get to the first century, the time of Jesus, the synagogue, practice of gathering in the synagogue, even though the temple had been rebuilt and that the blood sacrifices of the temple were continuing again, the practice of going to synagogue was very common and established. And we see this in the Gospels. In Luke's Gospel, for example, Jesus begins his public ministry going to the synagogue and speaking in the synagogue. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus begins his public ministry and his first miracle, which is an exorcism, in the synagogue. That would have been the norm at the time of Jesus. And one of the other things we want to keep in mind too is at the time of Jesus, Israel was part of the Roman Empire. And so this will help with the expansion of Christianity, because you have the Roman road systems and the Jews were scattered throughout the empire. And so we have synagogues all throughout the empire, particularly in places like Asia Minor, Greece, Rome. And so those would be places where the gospel begins to be proclaimed. And so really that existence of the synagogues throughout the empire is a catalyst for the spread of the faith in the beginning. Now, again, one of the things to keep in mind is in the very early church, the original followers of Jesus were Jews. And so they would continue to live as Jews but also as followers of the Christ. Okay, so on Saturdays, which was the Jewish Sabbath, and on other important days, they would be participating in the synagogue. And we see a couple examples of this in the Acts of the Apostles, particularly with St. Paul, who again is the great evangelist spreading the faith throughout the Roman Empire, and eventually he starts with the Jews, but eventually goes and is preaching to the Gentiles. So we see, for example, right after his conversion, Paul's conversion, he's still in Damascus. And so in Acts 9, verse 20, we hear that he began to proclaim Christ in the synagogue. Then later on, in their first mission to Cyprus, both Paul and Barnabas go to the synagogue. That's in Acts 13. And then a little bit later, we have Paul in Antioch going to the synagogue. What began to happen, though, is that there was tensions with the Jews. Of course, we know there was early persecution by the Jews, right? That's how we see the events that lead to Paul's conversion, as he's one of the ones leading this persecution of what was known at the time as the Way. But what we see in different places now is the tension between the Jews and the followers of the Christ in the synagogues, because they're preaching Christ as God. And so there's a split. And so what will eventually begin to happen, and what is important for us in our understanding of the liturgy of the Word and how that fits into what we know as the Mass today, is you get to a point where there is a complete split between Jews and Christians, beginning with Jews who are followers of the Christ, but then also the Gentiles. And so instead of continuing to go to the synagogue on the Jewish Sabbath, which was a Saturday, they incorporated that into their celebration of the Eucharist on the Lord's Day, day of his resurrection, which was Sunday. So prior to this split, Christians would go to synagogue on Saturday, and then they would go to celebrate in house churches and in people's homes, celebrate the Eucharist. Well, then once we had that split with the Jews, that became two parts of this Eucharistic celebration. And so that's the beginnings of where we get Liturgy of the Word, followed by Liturgy of the Eucharist in one event that we call the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. So in our next video, we'll talk a little bit about the structure of the Jewish synagogue service and how we see the Liturgy of the Word emerging from that. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you soon.